Hello, I'm Marawultus, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about populism, popular sovereignty, and democracy. Especially when it concerns how those things interact with my particular worldview and ideology. So, obviously, from the standpoint of the imperial theory of normative ethics, you have a situation where popular sovereignty or populism and democracy, if they overthrow the established order, are therefore considered invalid. Now, of course, that being said, it really depends on the structure of the established order. For example, if, let's say, the established order is a democratic order, then it makes sense that democracy would exist, and therefore it wouldn't make sense that democracy would therefore be a threat to the established order. If there is an established order, the leader of which works to change the order into a democratic order, then that is also allowable under that theory of ethics. However, popular uprisings and revolutions are not allowable as they are destructive to the system. And from a realist perspective, the perpetuation of the state is extremely important, which means that upsetting the order of the state, not in the sense of changing how things are aligned. That's not what I mean when I say upsetting the order. What I mean by upsetting the order is destroying the institutions, essentially, which I think is a dangerous thing to do. And that's why I generally have a preference for restructuring rather than outright destruction. I can see that an example wherein restructuring and outright destruction can be easily contrasted is the comparison between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, where in the American Revolution, the established order of course, the king and his authority was being removed. However, sorry, I've got a bit of a phlegmatic throat. However, when it concerns the actual structures of governance, the colonies, due to their distance to Britain, had to be able to have a large degree of autonomy, and therefore they already had existing structures of governance that then were the ones that actually went into rebellion. So it was actually uh, existing structures rebelling against another existing structure, which under the imperial ethic would not be a good thing. However, it certainly is better than what happened in the French Revolution, where there was massive killings of individuals believed to have been associated with high levels of government, and uh, and a total revolution in the sense that they not only did they get rid of the king and the monarchy, they got rid of several other established long-standing institutions in the country. They got rid of many cultural institutions to the point where um, it it was getting a bit weird, and it didn't really work at some point, and that's why several of those things reverted, although certain things stayed. But it ended up not working out as well in the long term as what happened with the American Revolution. Now, of course, I know that there's other reasons why the French Revolution didn't do the same as the American Revolution, but I'm not going to get into those right now. Now, when it concerns populism and popular sovereignty, I think it's very important to take a look at that from a realist perspective. And what do I mean by a realist perspective? Well, epistemic realism is an idea that there exists a real world independent of one's perception of it, And generally speaking, this is also followed by the idea that your perceptions and logic and reason and reliable sources can give you information about that world, and that your understanding of a world is confirmed by the consistency of those things in order that you create a coherent, or at least you attempt to create a coherent image of the world that you are interacting with. And the coherence of the image is confirmed or denied by how you interact with the world. Now, one might say, well, what about the brain in a jar hypothesis? Well, that's all well and good as a hypothesis, but the problem with that is what is actionable about that? What can you actually do? So I say that the choices that you make in the so-called real world are choices that either affect your surroundings or affect yourself in some way. And you know those choices have an impact by the fact that they have effects. And therefore your choices are meaningful in the sense that they change things, either about your surroundings or about yourself, even if that thing is theoretically a simulation. That wouldn't change the fact that things have changed. And I think that's an interesting thought. But anyway, I'm not into the brain in a jar hypothesis anyway. So anyway, going back into that. So what you need to do is you need to establish a realistic worldview, that is to say, a worldview of your surroundings that is coherent with what you know about your surroundings. And once you have that paradigm, you then need to examine your priorities. What are your goals? And you take those priorities and you examine them, and you have to ensure that those are consistent with what happens in the real world, and that's how you can create a utilitarian calculus of what action you should take. So, uh, that being said, when it concerns politics, therefore, it is important to have knowledge and understanding of the world and what's going on in order to make real decisions. Well, when I say real decisions, realistic decisions. Maybe that's the best word for that. In order to make realistic policy decisions, you need to understand what realistically is going on. So, when you then take that into account and you ask, is this possible? Now, an easy way to say that it's actually not possible, at least on a state level, is questions of military function and of intelligence. When I say intelligence, I don't mean one's intellect, but rather the secret goings on and the spying that occurs. So those things have to remain confidential from the populace. Why? Because if they do not, then they compromise significant advantages that the state has. Now, I'm not talking about domestic spying or domestic military plans. I'm talking about things that occur with other countries. And if, let's say, everybody had a right to look at those secret documents, at least every citizen, then all a country needs to do is, all a foreign power needs to do is bribe the least loyal citizen, and then they simply have access to all your intelligence network and your military plans and such things. And if you've ever read Sun Tzu, that's a very bad thing. It's a very bad thing. So that being said, that means that in order for all of those things to be functional, in order to have a strategic advantage, you essentially have to keep the people in the dark about your strategic plans, which means that it's actually impossible for the people to be significantly or sufficiently, I think that's a better term, sufficiently informed about foreign policy issues and about military plans in order to actually make realistic decisions regarding those. In other words, from a democratic perspective, you have a bit of a paradox where uh, someone who is in favor of direct democracy would want people to be able to make informed decisions and therefore would want them to have access to such information. But problematically speaking, there's also the issue that the people cannot uh, be informed of such things. Otherwise, the country loses significant advantages. Now, you might say, well, what if we just simply create agencies that then operate these things autonomously? Well, the problem then is a problem of accountability, because who are they going to be accountable to? The whole people. In a direct democracy, that doesn't really work. And then it also gives too much power to those individuals to do whatever they want because they know that they can't be subject to oversight. So you need intermediaries. You need individuals to stand in between the people and in between the crucial intelligence that is necessary for effective foreign policy making and effective strategic planning. And that means that direct democracy, at least on a large scale, does not work. Or at least it cannot work in a sense that the people cannot be significantly informed or sufficiently informed about those issues. So that's direct democracy out of the window. Now, when it concerns, again, therefore, ideas of populism, you end up with a question of not can the people be sufficiently informed, but are the people sufficiently informed to make big decisions? And that's an entirely different question, because the question of whether someone can be informed about something and the question of whether someone is informed about something has very different implications. Because in theory, I could go out and study any number of things and be well informed about any number of things. But the question is, am I actually going to do it? And that is the question that should be asked whenever populism is considered. Are the people actually going to be sufficiently informed about any issue in order to make a reasonable decision? And unfortunately, the answer is no. They are not going to be sufficiently informed. At least statistically speaking, they are not. So that, of course, causes huge problems in a democracy because you end up having a lot of people voting who, in theory, should vet themselves not to vote. Now, of course, that brings into the question of popular sovereignty. So there's a few different ways to approach popular sovereignty. One way is a voluntarist approach, where you say that the people as a group can decide things. However, if someone wants to opt out, they can opt out. And of course, that's not a way to run a state, because that means that people can just do whatever they want, and that's a terrible thing. Because you can just say, well, I don't like how the direction that you're going, I don't like the laws that you're going to try to make, so I'm just going to skip out on you, and then I don't have to follow your laws. And that's a very silly way to do that, because at least it's very weak to foreign invasion. I think that's the best way to put it. And also, it's very weak to infighting and splintering, which also makes it weaker to foreign invasion. So, another perspective is a majoritarian perspective, in the sense that the majority of the people need to participate in order for something to be democratically valid. Now, of course, as I have mentioned, I don't think that the majority of the people are significantly informed about many issues, which then puts that into a problematic category of how is this going to work? And this also means that what if people just don't want to be involved? What if people say, actually reasonably say, I don't have time to get to read up on the issues, so I'm just not going to vote. And then you have a minority electorship or a minority voting group. And that, of course, means that the government has delegitimized itself if it has a majoritarian perspective on participation in popular sovereignty. So, of course, the third perspective and the more common one is a participatory perspective, that individuals can choose to participate or choose not to participate. And if you choose not to participate when it concerns questions of popular sovereignty, your non-participation is considered a equivalent to a legal no contest, in the sense that you're not voting for something, but you're also not voting against something. So when the vote is counted, the only people who are counted are people who are voting. And that's how I think most countries run. Uh, and I think it works better than the other two systems, but it still has the flaw of what if there's massive voter registration drives and a lot of people who generally would normally not consider themselves to be qualified for voting choose to instead vote? Or what if people are incentivized to vote with bribes and things like that? And that's, of course, a problem as well. So, and of course, it still runs into the problem of certain things not being available to the people to make decisions on. And that's why I think having intermediate levels, and therefore what can be considered a representative democracy, is superior to a direct democracy. Okay, so another problem with popular sovereignty is the idea that the people are actually sovereign, functionally speaking, which is something that almost never is true. A lot of countries that have that claim to be operated under popular sovereignty actually have that as a facade or an illusion, uh, simply stating that to confirm and legitimate themselves and their democratic systems. Now, how do I know that this is not true? Well, the answer is, who is making the laws? Who is making the decisions? And if you don't have a direct democracy, then I say you don't have a popular sovereignty. Because if the individuals making the decision are not the people, then those individuals, therefore, are not sovereign. If the people who decide whether a court case challenging government decisions gets thrown out of court are is not a plebiscite, but rather judges, lawyers, and other groups that are appointed by the government, then you also don't have a popular sovereignty, because the people don't have the final say. Where does the buck stop? And I'll tell you, it's not at the people. So, therefore, popular sovereignty in most cases, wherein it is claimed, does not actually exist, uh, as the systems actually are operated by other individuals who claim to represent the people, but who are themselves moral agents who are capable of making choices, and those choices might not always align with what the people want. So what about the will of the people, the voice of the people? What do the people want? And as I mentioned before, the people are not always informed enough about certain issues. And that means that populism in itself is somewhat of an incoherent way to run a country, because the people can easily be swayed in large groups by varying ideologies. And to say that that is good because the will of the people is occurring is in some ways a denial of realism. Because realistically speaking, if there is a consistent order in the universe, if there is a predictable cause and effect, then if you have particular goals, then that means that there are objectively better or superior and objectively worse or inferior ways of achieving those goals. And that means that when it concerns foreign policy, when it concerns governments, there's always going to be a I guess you could call it a tier list of decisions that you could make. Certain decisions are better, certain decisions are worse. Now, to the individual level, you could say an example would be, let's say, you want to survive. So you can choose to either nourish yourself or to starve yourself. One of those decisions is going to make it significantly more likely for you to survive, and one of them is going to make it significantly less likely for you to survive. And that is an objective perspective. So that means that certain decisions are going to be objectively superior to other decisions. So then the question is, how do we establish an epistemic for knowing which decisions those are? How do we find out? How do we get the knowledge of that into our heads? And the answer is not by simply asking everybody, hey, which decision do you think is better? Because not everybody is informed enough on all those issues to actually make a choice that is based on a holistic understanding of the situation. And this means that populism in itself is an unrealistic ideology. And now let me just say that I'm not disparaging democracy. I'm not saying that the people shouldn't have a voice. I'm not saying that the people shouldn't be able to make decisions. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is to, on a philosophical level, say that it is wise, and that you love this wisdom, this philosophy, that it is wise to let the people make all the decisions. I think that's an unwise standpoint and rather foolish, as it has been shown time and time again to actually not work very well. So I will say that that's why my particular system takes the principle of representative democracy and combines that with the principle of cellular democracy. And that means that there's multiple levels to it. And the reason that is because I believe that when it concerns decisions, those decisions should be made in a wise manner. But how do we decide who is wise? So I instead of going the route of, well, let's make a degree or let's have a panel of oligarchs or something like that, I instead decided, why don't we let the people decide who's wise? So, however, for that to work, we need to get the wise men close to the people. And that means that the people that are elected locally. And then those individuals, being considered wise by the people, get together and elect individuals whom they consider wise above themselves, etc. And I think that that's something that, from a philosophical perspective, is very beautiful, because it creates a government that, in theory, should indeed increase in wisdom the higher you go up in it. And it creates a situation where media manipulation and large amounts of campaign funding and things like that don't really have an effect on politics as much as they do in a system where individuals are directly elected to the top. And I think that's very good. And at the same time, my system also incorporates a full democracy on the local level, where the people can get together and decide what type of economic system they want and what type of social organization they want. And they can do that, and they can make all those policies on the local level. Why on the local level? Because that's where they live, and that's where we can trust people to be informed on the things that affect them in their daily lives. And that's what I like about my system. And that's why I'm against this full type of populism that is becoming more popular lately, because it's very easy to manipulate people. It is. It's just look at history, is all I'm going to say. It's very easy to find individuals who can say big words and can sway and persuade individuals to do this thing or the other thing. And unfortunately, this is something that is a weakness in most current systems of democracy. So I decided to instead develop a system where such a thing could not happen. And that's how I came to my particular system. And so anyway, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that populism is uh, is superior to realism? Do you think that popular sovereignty does exist? Do you think that there's another way to do democracy that perhaps I haven't considered? Tell me all those things in the comment section below, and ideally, uh, we can have a civil discourse. And I think that's something that's very important. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on a Wiltus Over and Out.